They beat her until her screams broke into silence. Then they tied her ankles with coarse rope and hauled her upside down into the burning sun. Blood dripped from her split lip, a single dark tear against the dust on her cheek. Every lash of the whip had left a mark meant to shame, not just to hurt. She wasn't hanging there to die quickly. No, this was a display. She was hung like an animal, a piece of meat left out for the buzzards and the warnings. The wind, hot and unforgiving, carried her shallow breaths. They were ragged, uneven, like a flame about to be snuffed out by the sheer cruelty of the world. Beneath her, half buried in the dirt, a crude wooden sign lay splintered. The words, scrawled in angry red paint, were still clear. The white man never forgets. The desert was silent except for the groan of the rope as her body swayed. Her hair hung in tangled strands, brushing the dust, black as a starless night. Her wrists, bound behind her back, were raw and swollen. Her chest rose with a desperate, heroic effort. Each breath was a rebellion, a tiny war waged against the inevitable. For hours, no one came. The men who left her there wanted her to be seen. They wanted her to be found. A living curse carved into flesh and memory, a warning to anyone who dared stand with her. Elias Ford was not supposed to be here. He was supposed to be miles away, trailing a stray calf through dry washes and thorn brush. The sun was a cruel hammer overhead, the kind of heat that cracks lips and splits the very earth. He had been counting on solitude, the kind he trusted more than people. But the desert, it seems, had other plans for him. He heard it at first as a sound too faint to be real, a weak gasp carried on the wind. His horse, a seasoned buckskin named Dust, stiffened beneath him. Its ears twitched, catching the sound long before Elias could make sense of it. He knew it was no ghost. He slid from the saddle, his rifle slung across his back, his boots crunching softly on the unforgiving ground. He followed the sound through a maze of juniper and stone, and then he found the clearing. There she was, a girl, no older than 18, dangling upside down from the gnarled branch of an old cottonwood tree. The sun burned across her bare legs and bruised arms. Her eyes were half closed, her lashes thick with dust, her lips cracked and bleeding. Elias froze, his gut clenched like a fist. His eyes fell to the sign in the dirt, and the red letters glared back at him. The white man never forgets. It wasn't just a message, it was a damnation, a promise that anyone who touched her would share her fate. He cursed under his breath, a low, guttural sound that was swallowed by the silence. His hand went to the long-bladed knife at his belt. It was a simple tool, used for skinning game and cutting rope. Now it felt like the heaviest thing in the world. Just as his fingers closed around the hilt, the girl stirred, a barely perceptible motion. Her head turned, a weak, agonizing movement. Her voice was a broken whisper, but the words cut through the air like shards of glass. "Don't," she rasped. "Don't cut me loose. They will kill you." Her eyes fluttered open. They were dark pools of fear, but deep within them a fire still burned, a stubborn, defiant flame. In that instant, Elias felt the ground tilt beneath his feet. This wasn't just a girl hanging from a tree. This was a choice, a crossroads laid out in blood and dust. If he walked away, he would live. He'd ride back to his solitary life, haunted by the memory of her eyes, but he would live. If he cut her down, he was as good as dead. He would be marked, hunted. The rope creaked, a mournful sound in the dead air. A single drop of blood slid from her temple and fell, hitting the dust below with a sound he almost imagined he could hear. Elias's chest rose and fell, his breath catching in his throat. His hand tightened on the knife. The desert around them was too still, as if the wind itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what he would do. He took a step closer, then another. The steel of the knife gleamed in the sun, a thin, cold promise of mercy. Her gaze clung to him, silent, pleading, but also warning. He could feel the weight of every ghost behind her words, every man who had ever died for making the wrong choice in a place like this. Elias was no longer a rancher chasing a lost calf. He was a man standing at the precipice of his own fate. One cut of the rope would bind his life to hers. One cut would ignite a firestorm of vengeance that would consume them both. His heart pounded against his ribs like war drums. His breath was iron and dust. The knife rose, the rope strained, and the world seemed to shrink down to this single, terrible moment. He cut the rope. The fibers snapped with a sound like a gunshot, and the girl dropped hard into his arms. Her body was light, terrifyingly light, as if she hadn't had a real meal in weeks. Her skin burned with fever. For a heart-stopping moment, he thought she might already be gone, that he was too late. But then her chest rose with a weak, shaky breath. She was alive. He carried her back to his horse, every step feeling heavier than the last. He could feel the eyes of the desert on him, the ghosts of the men who had put her there. The broken sign in the dirt seemed to glare at his back, its curse following him. The white man never forgets. He spat into the dust, a small act of defiance, and gently tied her across the saddle. By the time they reached the old, forgotten way station, the sun had bled out across the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The building leaned against the wind, its roof patched with rusted tin, its walls the color of old bones. It was no home, but it was shelter. And right now, shelter was everything. Elias laid her carefully on a dusty cot, covering her with his worn wool coat. He poured a little water from his canteen into a tin cup. She tried to drink, coughed, then sipped again. Her eyes, dark and guarded, never left his face. She watched him like a wild animal that had been cornered and beaten one too many times. She expected a blow, not kindness. He spoke low, his voice steady, trying not to spook her. "You're safe here," he said. "At least for now." She said nothing. She just pulled the coat tighter around her shoulders, creating a fragile barrier between herself and the world. The night stretched long and silent. Elias gently cleaned the raw cuts on her wrists, wiping the dried blood from her face with a damp cloth. She flinched at his touch, a tremor running through her small frame, but she didn't pull away. He worked slowly, carefully, as if she were made of glass and might shatter in his hands. When he finished, he sat back in a rickety wooden chair, the flickering light of a single lantern casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. He was a man who had spent years cultivating solitude, wrapping it around himself like a shield. Yet tonight, the silence felt different. It was heavier, filled with the weight of her ragged breathing, the soft rustle of the coat as she shifted on the cot. Every so often he'd catch her eyes on him in the gloom, sharp and restless. She'd look away quickly, but not before he saw the fight still burning there, the unquenched spirit that had refused to let her die on that tree. Hours passed. Coyotes cried in the distance, their lonely calls echoing across the vast emptiness. The desert air grew cold, seeping through the cracks in the old station's walls. Elias laid his rifle across his lap and waited for a sleep that never came. He was a sentry now, a guardian. He had made his choice. At dawn, a sound he hadn't expected woke him from his weary vigil. The girl was sitting up. Her hair was a tangled mess, her face was bruised and pale, but her eyes were fixed on him. Her voice was rough, dry as the desert floor, but it was clear enough to make his heart pause. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you cut me down?" The question hung in the still morning air, sharp and heavy as a blade. And Elias knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that whatever answer he gave, it would bind their fates together forever. There was no going back now. The rope was cut. Elias didn't answer right away. He just watched her, the first light of dawn painting a pale stripe across the dusty floor between them. Her question wasn't just a question. It was a challenge, a test. He leaned back in his chair, his hands folded over the rifle on his lap. The truth was a tangled, complicated thing, but he had to give her a piece of it. "Because no one," he said, his voice rough from the long night, "deserves to be left hanging like that." It was a simple answer, but it was the truest one he had. Her eyes narrowed, searching his face, looking for the lie. She was like a hawk, studying its prey, trying to decide if he could be trusted. For a long while she said nothing, just pulled the coat tighter, as if trying to hide from the memory of the rope, the sun, the whispers of the men who had left her there. Finally she spoke again, her voice a near whisper. "They wanted me to die slow, not quick. Slow, so everyone could see." The words hit Elias like a physical blow. He knew cruelty. He'd seen it in the war, seen it in the hard eyes of men out here where the law was thin. But hearing it from her lips, seeing the memory of it in her eyes, made it real and heavy. It was like the weight of that broken sign had followed them, seeping into the very walls of this sanctuary. "What's your name?" he asked, trying to change the subject, trying to pull them both back from the edge of that darkness. She looked away, her gaze drifting to the single dirty window. For a moment he thought she wouldn't answer. "Naiva," she said at last, but something in her tone, a slight hesitation, told him it wasn't the whole truth. It was a name, but maybe not her name. Still he nodded, accepting it. "Naiva," he repeated. "I'm Elias." The next few days passed in an uneasy rhythm. She ate little, spoke less, but her eyes followed his every move. They were eyes that held stories she wasn't ready to share. Elias hunted rabbits for them to eat, brought fresh water from a hidden well a mile away, and did his best to make the decaying way station feel less like a tomb. At night, he slept in the chair by the door, his rifle always within reach. He was waiting. He didn't know for what, but he felt it coming. The desert always collects its debts. On the third morning, he saw them. Boot prints in the dirt outside, fresh, sharp, military issue. His jaw tightened. He crouched low, studying the tracks. At least 2 men. They had circled the station, quiet as ghosts, then moved on. They were being watched. He stepped back inside, his movements silent. Naiva was already by the window, tense as a coiled snake. She had seen them too. "You seen anyone?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. She just shook her head, her fingers twisting the fabric of the blanket until her knuckles turned white. The fragile peace they had found was gone, shattered. That evening, a rider came. Not sneaking around, but bold as brass, riding right up to the door. He wore a blue and gold uniform. A cavalry lieutenant, his face young but his eyes old and hard. He dismounted, and Elias met him on the porch, his hand resting casually near the pistol on his hip. The lieutenant didn't waste time on pleasantries. He pulled a folded paper from inside his coat and handed it to Elias. It was a wanted notice. And the sketch on it was her. Naiva. The words below the drawing burned into Elias's mind. Murder, escapee, dangerous. A reward was offered, $50. A fortune out here, enough to make a man betray his own brother. Elias stared at the paper, his face a perfect mask of indifference. He felt Naiva's presence behind him, a frozen stillness in the doorway. He handed the paper back to the lieutenant without a blink. "Can't say I've seen her," he said, his voice flat and even. "Just passing through myself." The lieutenant's eyes narrowed. He studied Elias for a moment too long, his gaze sweeping over the station, lingering on the doorway where Naiva was hidden in the shadows. Elias didn't flinch. He just stared back, his expression unreadable. Finally, the soldier grunted, swung himself back into his saddle, and rode off, disappearing into the twilight. Elias turned and walked back inside. Naiva stood frozen behind the curtain, her eyes wide. She had heard every word. He saw a storm of emotions in her gaze, suspicion, fear, but also something new, a flicker of something that might have been wonder. Why lie for her? Why risk so much for a stranger? The truth was, Elias didn't rightly know himself. But as he looked at her, standing there so small and fierce, he knew the silence between them had changed. It wasn't a wall of mistrust anymore. It was the beginning of something fragile, something dangerous. And that's when the real trouble began. Because the desert doesn't keep secrets for long. And the men who wanted her dead were not the kind to give up easily. The $50 reward was just the beginning. The real price on her head was one that would be paid in blood. Elias knew they couldn't stay. The lieutenant's visit was a warning shot. The next visitors wouldn't be so polite. The boot prints in the dirt proved it. They were being scouted, sized up. The way station, which had been a shelter, was now a trap waiting to be sprung. That night, under the thin, silver light of a half-moon, he saddled the horses. Dust, his buckskin, nickered softly, sensing the urgency. He helped Naiva climb onto the other horse, a quiet mare. Her body was still weak, bruised and tender, but the fire in her eyes burned steady and bright. She was a survivor. They rode south, south toward the border, toward the jagged promise of mountains where her people, the Apache, might still live free. Away from the bounty posters and the cavalry patrols. They rode through the night, leaving the cursed way station behind them, a lonely silhouette against the stars. For 2 days, the desert seemed to let them pass. The heat shimmered on the horizon by day, and the coyotes sang their lonely songs by night. Naiva spoke little, but she rode close beside him, her presence a constant, silent question. Sometimes, he'd catch her looking at him when she thought he wasn't paying attention. He could almost hear her thoughts, weighing his soul, trying to decide if the man who had cut her down from a tree could truly be trusted. On the 3rd night, the quiet broke. A single crack of a rifle tore through the silence of the night. It was sharp, definitive, and deadly. Elias felt a searing, white-hot fire spread across his side. He gasped. The air knocked from his lungs and toppled from the saddle, hitting the hard, rocky ground with a sickening thud. "Elias!" Naiva's scream was a raw, terrified sound. She was off her horse in an instant, dropping beside him. Another shot whizzed past her head, striking sparks from a rock on the ridge above them. Against the moonlight he could see them, shadows on horseback. At least 3 riders, their rifles raised. They were caught, trapped in the open. Naiva grabbed Elias under the arms, her small frame straining with the effort. She began to drag him toward a nearby cluster of boulders, the only cover for 100 yards. His boots scraped through the dirt, leaving a dark trail of his own blood behind him. "Leave me," he rasped, coughing. The taste of blood filled his mouth. "Run. Run while you can." Her hands only clenched tighter. Her voice broke, choked with tears, but her words were as fierce as a she-wolf's. "No! If you die, I die!" Somehow, with a strength he couldn't comprehend, she got him into the shelter of the rocks. Bullets chipped stone just inches above their heads, sending shards flying into the darkness. Naiva pressed her body against his, trying to shield him, as if her own flesh and bone could stop a lead ball. Her heart pounded like a drum against his back, but her hands were steady as she ripped a piece of her own shirt and pressed it hard against his bleeding side. The gunfire slowed. The riders were circling, patient now. They knew he was hit. They knew it was just a matter of time. Elias gritted his teeth, fighting the waves of darkness that threatened to pull him under. The pain was a living thing, clawing at him. Through the haze of pain, he heard her whisper. Something soft, something urgent, a secret she had held close to her chest. "My name is not Naiva," she whispered, her breath warm against his ear. "My true name is Yelena." She paused, then added the translation, her voice filled with a defiant pride. "It means the wind that never bows." He managed to open his eyes to meet hers in the dim light, and in that moment, he saw her. He saw not just a frightened girl he had saved from a rope, but a woman, a warrior who had just chosen to save him. Her lips brushed his forehead. They were soft and trembling, a stark contrast to the hardness of the rock and the cold steel of the rifles aimed at them. "You are mine now," she whispered, the words a fierce, possessive vow, "and I will not let this desert take you." The night hung heavy around them, thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. They both knew the fight wasn't over. It was only a lull in the storm, because when dawn came, the men who wanted her dead would return. And this time, they wouldn't just bring bullets. They would bring hell with them, and they were trapped right in the middle of it. The night stretched on, long and cruel. Every sound, every gust of wind made them flinch, expecting the final rush. But somehow, Elias and Ayelena made it through. When the first pale light of dawn crept over the horizon, the riders were gone. Maybe they feared the rocks, a perfect spot for an ambush. Maybe they feared the kind of spirit that refuses to break, even when riddled with bullets. Or maybe they just figured the desert would finish the job for them. By the time the sun burned high in the sky, the world was quiet again. The two of them were still alive, huddled together behind the blood-stained boulders. Elias leaned against the stone, weak and pale, but breathing. Elena sat close, her hand never leaving his, as if her touch alone could keep his soul from slipping away. She had carried him through fire, through blood, through the very edge of death itself. And in return, he had chosen her, a complete stranger, against every warning, against every curse carved into wood and memory. Their fates were no longer just bound. They were forged together in the crucible of that night. It took days, but they moved, slowly, painfully. Ailena, with her knowledge of the land, found water in places Elias would have overlooked. She found roots that could be chewed to dull the pain. She led them south, deeper into the unforgiving wilderness, until they found a hidden canyon with a small stream trickling through it. It was a place off the maps, a place where they could disappear. There, under the shade of ancient mesquite trees, Elias began to heal. Ayelena was a natural healer. She gathered herbs she recognized from her childhood, creating poultices to fight the infection in his wound. She cooked what little food they had, snaring small game with traps made from vines, and she stitched his wound closed using a sharpened piece of bone and thread pulled from her own clothes, her patience and focus absolute. She was a woman who had already seen too much loss, and she refused to see any more. Slowly, agonizingly, strength returned to his body, and as it did, something else grew between them in the quiet solitude of the canyon. A trust born not of words, but of shared survival. He saw the fierce intelligence in her eyes, the resilience that had been beaten but never broken. She saw the quiet strength in him, the decency that had made him stop for a girl left to die. They built a small, crude cabin of fallen logs and animal hide. It was nothing fancy, but it stood against the wind and kept out the rain. Elias, his side still aching, taught her how to handle his rifle, how to shoot straight and true. Elena, in turn, showed him the secrets of the desert, which plants healed, which ones could kill, and how to read the stories left in the dust. Then one day, as she sat humming by the fire, mending his shirt, he saw it. A slight, gentle curve to her belly that hadn't been there before. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The men who had beaten her, who had left her for dead, they had done more than that. They had left their mark on her in the most vile way possible. He felt a cold, hard rage build in his chest, a rage so pure and powerful it almost choked him. But when he looked at her face, he saw no shame. He saw no defeat. He saw only a quiet determination. She was carrying a child conceived in violence, But she would not let that child's story begin with hate. It would begin with survival. It would begin with her. And in that moment, Elias knew he wasn't just protecting a woman he had rescued. He was protecting his family. Their story was not one for the books, not one to be carved into stone monuments. It lived in the dust of the canyon, in the scars on their bodies, and in the unspoken promise that passed between them every day. It was a story about how they held on to each other when the world had tried its damnedest to tear them apart. But peace, in this land, is a fragile thing, a fleeting dream. One afternoon, while hunting, Elias found tracks at the mouth of the canyon. Not military boots this time. Something else. The tracks of a single shod horse. Someone had found them. Someone knew they were here. He raced back to the cabin, his heart pounding. The dream was over. The hunt had begun again. He burst through the door to find Elena standing stock still, a small carved wooden bird in her hand. She looked at him, her eyes wide with a new kind of fear. "He was here," she whispered. "An old man. He left this for the child." Elias took the bird from her. It was expertly carved, but on the bottom, a single letter was burned into the wood, the letter K. The blood drained from his face. He knew that mark. He knew that man. It wasn't the cavalry. It wasn't some random bounty hunter. It was someone far, far worse, someone from his own past. The man was Silas Kane, the most powerful and ruthless rancher in the territory. And the wanted poster, the one that accused her of murder, the man she had supposedly killed was Kane's son. The sign in the desert hadn't just been a generic threat. The white man never forgets. It wasn't a white man. It was the white man, Silas Kane, and he hadn't forgotten. He had been hunting them all along, and now he had found them. The wooden bird wasn't a gift. It was a message, a promise. "I am here, and I am coming for you." The carved bird felt heavy in Elias's hand, a wooden omen of death. Silas Kane. The name echoed from a part of his life he had tried to bury. He had worked for Kane once, years ago, before the war. He'd seen the man's ambition, the casual cruelty he used to build his empire. Kane owned the land, the law, and the men who enforced it. And Elias had just helped the woman accused of killing his only son. "We have to go," Elias said, his voice tight. "Now." But Elena shook her head, her jaw set with a stubbornness that matched the mountains around them. "We cannot run forever, Elias. This land is my home. I will not be chased from it." "This isn't a fight we can win," he argued, his voice rising with desperation. "You don't know this man. He's not just a rancher. He's a king in this territory. He'll send an army." "Then we will face an army," she said simply. But then she looked at him, her eyes pleading. "But first, you must know the truth. All of it." She told him everything. Not in a rush, but with a slow, painful deliberation. She told him about Kane's son, Jedediah. He wasn't the fine, upstanding boy his father pretended he was. He was a monster, with his father's cruelty, but none of his cunning. He and his friends had cornered her by a river. They had hurt her. They had laughed while they did it. She hadn't murdered him. She had fought back. In the struggle, Jedediah had fallen, his head striking a rock. It was an accident born of her desperation to survive. Her story poured out of her, a torrent of pain and injustice. The wanted poster was a lie, crafted by a grieving, vengeful father with enough money to buy any story he wanted. The men who had hung her from the tree were Kane's men, sent to deliver his personal brand of justice. Hearing the truth didn't make Elias feel better. It made him feel worse. It filled him with a cold, hard certainty. They couldn't run. Running would be an admission of guilt. Elena was right. They had to fight. Not with guns, not against an army. They had to fight with the truth. But how do you kill a lie when it's protected by a king? There was someone else there, Elena said softly, her voice barely a whisper. One of Jedediah's friends. His name was Billy. He wasn't like the others. He looked scared. He ran before it was over. A name, a chance. If they could find this Billy, if they could get him to talk, maybe, just maybe, they could prove her innocence. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only one they had. The hunt was on. But now, they weren't the only ones being hunted. They were hunting for a ghost, a witness who could set them free, while Silas Kane's army of hired guns hunted them. The desert had become a chessboard, and they were the two lonely pawns moving against a king and all his pieces. Their first stop was a dusty, wind-blown town called Redemption, a place that rarely lived up to its name. They needed supplies, and more importantly, information. They rode in separately at dusk, trying to look like just another pair of weary travelers. Elias went to the saloon, hoping to overhear some talk, while Ayelena went to the general store. The saloon was thick with smoke and the smell of cheap whiskey. Elias kept his hat low, nursing a single beer, listening. The talk was all about Kane, about the huge new bounty he'd placed on the head of the Apache girl who had killed his boy. $1,000. Enough money to make a saint turn sinner. Elias's gut went cold. The price had gone up. Kane was getting desperate. Then he heard the name. Billy. A couple of ranchers were talking in the corner. Young Billy Pritchett. They said he'd gone strange after Jedediah Kane's death. Quit his job at the Kane ranch. Took to drinking. Lived in a shack out by the old silver mine. Elias had his lead. He finished his beer and stood to leave. But as he turned, he locked eyes with a man at the bar. A man with a long scar down his cheek and the dead eyes of a killer. Elias had seen him before, riding with Kane's men. The man's eyes widened in recognition. His hand dropped to his gun. Time seemed to slow down. The laughter in the saloon faded. The piano player hit a sour note. Elias didn't hesitate. He drew his pistol, diving to the side as the bounty hunter's gun roared, splintering the bar where Elias's head had been. Elias fired from the floor, once, twice. The bounty hunter staggered back, a look of surprise on his face, before crashing to the ground. The saloon erupted into chaos. Men shouted, diving for cover. Elias was already on his feet, backing toward the door, his pistol sweeping the room. "He drew on me!" he yelled. "You all saw it!" He didn't wait for an answer. He burst out into the night just as Ayelena was running out of the general store. He grabbed her hand. "We have to go! Now!" Gunshots echoed behind them as they leaped onto their horses and galloped out of town, leaving the lights and the chaos of Redemption behind them. They had what they came for, a location for their witness. But now, Kane's hunters knew their faces. They weren't just chasing a rumor anymore. They were chasing Elias Ford and the Apache woman he was protecting. The odds had just gotten much, much worse. The shack by the old silver mine was even more desolate than it sounded. It was a leaning, pathetic structure, barely holding itself up against the harsh desert wind. They approached with caution, circling the place on foot, rifles ready. There was a faint light in the window, a flickering candle. Someone was home. Elias crept to the door, with Ayelena covering him from the shadows of a nearby rock formation. He kicked the door open, his rifle up, ready for anything. The man inside yelped, spilling a bottle of whiskey on the floor. He was young, barely out of his teens, with a thin, scared face and haunted eyes. It was Billy Pritchett. "Don't shoot!" he whimpered, holding his hands up. "We're not here to hurt you," Elias said, his voice low and steady. "We're here to talk." Elena stepped into the light of the doorway, and Billy's face went white as a sheet. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. "You," he whispered, staring at her. "Tell him what happened," Ayelena said, her voice soft but firm. "Tell him the truth." At first, Billy refused. He was terrified. He knew what Silas Kane did to people who crossed him. But as Ayelena spoke, as she described the fear in his own eyes that day by the river, Something in him broke. Tears streamed down his face, and the whole story came tumbling out. He confirmed everything: Jedediah's cruelty, the attack, her self-defense. He had been haunted by it ever since. "I wanted to say something," he sobbed, "but I was scared. I'm still scared." "You have a choice," Elias said, his voice hard. "You can keep hiding out here, drinking yourself to death, waiting for Cain to decide you're a loose end that needs to be tied up. Or you can ride with us, tell your story to the territorial marshal, and live the rest of your life as a free man." It was a stark choice, and it hung in the air of the tiny shack. Billy's sobs subsided. He looked from Elias's determined face to Ayelena's stoic expression. He wiped his nose on his sleeve. "All right," he said, his voice shaking. "All right, I'll do it." They had their witness. For the first time, a sliver of hope cut through the darkness. But as they prepared to leave, a sound drifted on the night air. The unmistakable sound of approaching horses. Lots of them. The bounty hunter in Redemption must have had friends, and they had followed them. "They've found us!" Billy cried, his newfound courage evaporating. "Out the back," Elias ordered, pushing him toward a small, broken window. "Get to the horses, go!" A hail of bullets ripped through the thin wooden walls of the shack. The single candle was extinguished, plunging them into darkness. Splinters flew through the air. Elias returned fire, aiming at the muzzle flashes outside, providing cover as Ayelena and Billy scrambled out the window. He waited a few seconds, fired another volley, then dove out the window after them, rolling as he hit the ground. He could hear them yelling outside, organizing for an attack. They were surrounded. The old mine was their only chance. "The mine!" he yelled, and the three of them sprinted for the dark, gaping hole in the side of the hill just as the full force of the posse descended on the now empty shack. They scrambled into the darkness of the mine shaft, the smell of damp earth and stale air enveloping them. Behind them, the night was filled with shouts and gunfire. They were trapped, cornered like rats in a hole. Their one sliver of hope had just led them into a tomb. The darkness inside the mine was absolute. It was a cold, suffocating blackness that swallowed sound and light. Elias fumbled in his pouch, his fingers finding a match. He struck it against the rock wall, and the sudden, sputtering flame cast long, dancing shadows down the narrow tunnel. They were in the main shaft, but it branched off into a dozen smaller tunnels, a maze of forgotten labor. "They'll wait for us to come out," Billy whispered, his voice trembling. "Or they'll come in after us." "Let them come," Ayelena said, her voice calm and steady in the dark. She had her knife in her hand, the blade catching the faint matchlight. She was not afraid of the dark. She was born of it. Elias lit a rusted old lantern they found just inside the entrance. Its weak yellow glow pushed back the darkness, but only just. "We need to find another way out," he said. "These old mines sometimes connect to other shafts, air vents." Their desperate search began. They moved deeper into the earth, their footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. The air grew thin and stale. Wooden support beams, slick with moisture, groaned under the immense weight of the mountain above them. It felt like being buried alive. Hours passed. Outside, they could occasionally hear the muffled shouts of the posse. They knew they were trapped. They were just waiting, patient as vultures. Then they found it. A small, narrow tunnel, barely big enough to crawl through. A faint, almost imperceptible draft of fresh air flowed from it. It had to lead somewhere. "I'll go first," Elias said. He handed the lantern to Ayelena. "If I'm not back in an hour, you two find a place to hide. Don't follow me." He squeezed into the narrow passage, the rock scraping against his shoulders. It was a slow, agonizing crawl through the guts of the mountain. Twice the tunnel was nearly blocked by fallen rock, and he had to painstakingly move the stones one by one in the pitch black. He was guided only by the faint draft of air, a promise of the world outside, Just when he thought he couldn't go any further, that the tunnel was a dead end, he saw it. A tiny pinprick of light. Hope surged through him. He crawled faster, his hands raw, his body aching. The pinprick grew into a small circle of gray light. It was an old air shaft driven straight up through the rock. Above him, maybe 30 feet, was the night sky. He returned to the others, and together they made the perilous climb. It was a sheer rock face, with only the smallest of handholds. Elias went first, with Billy, terrified but resolute, following close behind. Ayelena came last, climbing with a strength and agility that defied her small frame and her pregnancy. They emerged from the earth like ghosts, covered in dust and grime, into the cold air of the pre-dawn. They were on the far side of the mountain. Below them they could see the flicker of the posse's campfire by the mine entrance. They had made it. They were free. But their ordeal was far from over. They had their witness, but they were afoot, with no supplies, miles from the nearest town where the territorial marshal held court. And Silas Kane was still out there, his net closing in around them. They walked for 2 days, surviving on what Ayelena could find and the little water they could carry. Billy Pritchett, to Elias's surprise, held up. The terrified boy was being burned away by the hardship, replaced by a quiet, determined man. He had made his choice, and he was seeing it through. They finally reached the town of Prosperity, the seat of the territorial government. It was bigger and more civilized than Redemption, with brick buildings and a telegraph office. But it was also Kane's territory. His influence was everywhere. The marshal's office was a small, unassuming building on the main street. They walked in, 3 ragged, exhausted figures. The marshal was an older man, with a long, gray mustache and weary eyes that had seen too much. His name was Fenton. Elias laid his rifle on the desk. "We're not here to make trouble, Marshal. We're here to see justice done." For the next hour, they told him everything. Ayelena spoke of the attack, her voice never wavering. Billy, his hands shaking, corroborated her story, every painful detail. Elias filled in the rest, the hanging, the bounty hunters, the escape from the mine. Marshal Fenton listened, his expression unreadable. When they were done, he leaned back in his chair, stroking his mustache. "That's a hell of a story," he said slowly. "You're accusing Silas Kane of conspiracy, attempted murder, and a dozen other things. You realize who he is?" "We realize," Elias said. "But it's the truth. The truth," the marshal sighed, "is a tricky thing in this territory. It's often whatever Silas Kane says it is." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street. His word against a scared boy and an Apache girl with a price on her head. Just then, the door to the office swung open, and Silas Kane walked in. He was not a large man, but he filled the room with his presence. He had cold, intelligent eyes, and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He was flanked by 2 men, the kind who looked like they were born with guns in their hands. He ignored Elias and Billy completely, his eyes fixed on Ayelena, and the look in them was a venomous mix of hatred and grief. "Marshal," Kane said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble, "I'm here for my son's murderer." "Now, hold on, Silas," Marshal Fenton said, holding up a hand. "These folks have just made some serious accusations against you." Kane laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "Accusations? From this filth? She killed my boy. That's all the truth that matters." He took a step forward, his hand resting on the butt of his holstered pistol. "I've got a legal warrant for her, and I'm taking her." The room was electric with tension. It was all about to come apart. Elias moved to stand in front of Ayelena, his own hand hovering over his gun. The 2 deputies with Kane mirrored the movement. It was a standoff, 4 guns, 1 small room, and the truth hanging in the balance. The marshal was caught in the middle, his face grim. He was the law, but in Prosperity, Silas Kane was the power, and power always trumps the law. The world shrank to the space between the men. The click of a hammer being pulled back would be the last sound some of them ever heard. Marshal Fenton stood between them, a man of the law caught between a force of nature and an immovable object. "I am the law here, Silas," Fenton said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of his badge. "And in this office my word is final. Everyone stands down." For a tense second, nobody moved. Kane's cold eyes stared at Elias, a silent promise of death. Then, with a slight, almost imperceptible nod from Kane, his two men relaxed. Elias didn't. He knew this was just a temporary pause. "This is a farce," Kane sneered. "You're listening to the lies of a killer and a coward," he said, nodding his head toward Billy, who flinched. "My son is dead. That is the only fact." "There is another fact," Ayelena said, stepping out from behind Elias. She faced the man who wanted her dead, her gaze unwavering. Her hand went to her own belly, resting on the gentle curve. "Your son left his mark on me. Your grandchild grows here, a child born of his violence. Is that a lie, Silas Kane?" The room went dead silent. Even Kane was stunned. He stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. The child she carried wasn't just some abstract consequence, it was his bloodline, tainted by the truth of his son's monstrous actions. Marshal Fenton saw his opening. "Silas, this changes things. There needs to be a proper hearing. A circuit judge will be here in a week. Until then, he pointed at Ayelena, will remain in my custody, for her own protection. You," he looked at Elias and Billy, "will be held as material witnesses, and you, Silas, will let the law handle this." Kane looked like he was about to explode. His empire, his name, his carefully constructed lie, it was all unraveling because of one defiant Apache woman. But he was also smart. A public fight in the marshal's office was not his way. He preferred the shadows. He turned without another word and stormed out, his men following like loyal dogs. The threat was gone from the room, but everyone knew it was just gathering force outside. The next week was the longest of Elias's life. They were held in the jail cells, not as prisoners, but as protected witnesses. It was a strange kind of sanctuary. Through the barred window, they could see Kane's men all over town, watching, waiting. The town of prosperity was holding its breath, waiting for the storm to break. During that week, something shifted between Elias and Ayelena. Trapped in the quiet confines of the jail, they talked. He told her about his life before, about the war that had hollowed him out and sent him searching for solitude. She told him more about her people, their songs, their stories, their connection to the land that Kane was trying to steal. He watched her, this woman who had survived so much, who carried so much strength and so much pain. The bond that had been forged in survival was deepening into something else, something he hadn't let himself feel in a very long time. The day the judge was due to arrive, the town was buzzing. The street in front of the courthouse was filled with people, drawn by the drama of the powerful Silas Kane being challenged. It was a spectacle. Marshal Fenton came to their cells. "It's time," he said, his face grim. "Stick to the truth. It's all you've got." He led them across the street to the courthouse. Kane's men were everywhere, their eyes following their every step. They were like wolves circling a wagon train. Elias walked close to Ayelena, a protective shield against the hateful stares. The courtroom was packed. Silas Kane sat at the front, his face like thunder. The judge was a stern, impartial-looking man from back east, a man who hopefully couldn't be bought. Billy Pritchett was called to the stand first. He was terrified, his voice barely a whisper at first. But as he spoke, as he recounted the truth he had held inside for so long, his voice grew stronger. The courtroom was silent, hanging on his every word. He told them everything, not sparing himself, admitting his own cowardice. When he was done, a murmur went through the crowd. It was a powerful testimony. Kane's lawyer tried to tear him apart, calling him a drunk and a liar, but the truth held firm. Then, Ayelena was called. She walked to the stand with a quiet dignity that silenced the room. She didn't speak like a victim. She spoke like a survivor. She told her story, her voice clear and strong. She looked directly at Silas Kane as she described what his son had done. Kane couldn't take it. He leaped to his feet. Lies! All of it! She's a savage, a murderer! That's enough, Mr. Kane, the judge boomed, banging his gavel. Sit down or I'll have you removed. Kane sat, but the damage was done. The crowd had seen his rage, his lack of control. They had seen the hatred that was driving him. The tide of opinion in the room was beginning to turn, but it was still her word against a dead man's reputation. The judge looked troubled. It wasn't enough. And then, the back door of the courtroom opened. An old man, leaning on a cane, slowly walked in. It was Doc Abernathy, the town doctor who had tended to Jedediah Kane's body. He was a man known to be in Kane's pocket. Your Honor, he said, his voice frail but clear. I have something to say. Something I should have said a long time ago. Everyone turned to stare. Silas Kane's face went pale. The doctor, who he thought he owned, was about to betray him. Doc Abernathy walked to the stand. He looked at Silas Kane with eyes full of pity and regret. I have been this town's doctor for 30 years, he began. I have kept many secrets. Too many. Jedediah Kane, he was a sick boy, a violent boy. I stitched up at least half a dozen people he'd beaten for no good reason. His father always paid me to keep quiet, to protect the family name. He then unrolled a set of medical notes. When I examined Jedediah's body, I found scratches on his arms, bruises on his knuckles. He had been in a fight, a brutal one. What this young woman says, it fits the evidence I saw. I lied on my official report. I lied for Silas. I can't live with that lie anymore. It was the final nail in the coffin of Kane's story. The courtroom erupted. The truth was out, undeniable. Silas Kane just sat there, a broken man. His son wasn't a martyr. He was a monster. His legacy was a lie. The power he had wielded for so long vanished in an instant, replaced by the shame of the truth. He looked old and small. The king had been dethroned. The judge slammed his gavel. All charges against Ayelena are dismissed. The bounty is null and void. She is a free woman. A cheer went up in the courtroom. Elias grabbed Ayelena, hugging her tightly as tears of relief streamed down her face. It was over. They had won. They had fought the lie, and for once, the truth had been enough. They walked out of the courthouse, blinking in the bright sunlight. The crowd parted for them, their faces a mixture of awe and respect. They were no longer outcasts. They were survivors. Elias, Ayelena, and Billy left Prosperity that day, riding not south into the desert, but north, toward the mountains, and the promise of a new life. They found a small valley, with a clear river running through it, a place where they could finally be at peace. They built a proper cabin, with a stone fireplace and a real roof. Elias worked the land. Ayelena made a home, and a few months later, as the first snows began to fall in the high country, she gave birth to a daughter, a beautiful, healthy baby girl with her mother's dark eyes and fierce spirit. They named her Hope. Their story was never written in any books, but it lived on, in the dust of the desert and the quiet strength of the mountains. It was a story about how sometimes the greatest act of love isn't a whispered promise, but a simple choice. The choice to cut someone down when the world wants them to hang. The choice to stand and fight for the truth, even when it costs you everything. And if this story moved you, if it gave you something to think about, do me a favor. Tap that subscribe button and ring the bell for notifications. That way you won't miss the next story from these wild lands, where the deepest secrets are often buried just beneath the surface, waiting for someone brave enough to dig them up.